Wer viel wagt, gewinnt auch viel. Komm, du schönes Glockenspiel, lass die Glöckchen klingen, klingen, lass die Ohren ihnen singen.
Das klingt so herrlich, das klingt so schön.
Das klingt so herrlich, says the unfortunate Monostatos in the magic flute, reduced to a robot by the sounds of the Glockenspiel, or rather by the music of the Glockenspieler, Mozart. A genius, both ingenuous and sophisticated, both trivial and profound, not by turns, but at one and the same time. There has never been a composer who appeals to so many of the listener's sensibilities so consistently. For many, Mozart was the greatest of all composers. But such claims are part of a critic's game and unassessable. And yet, however impossible it is to make ranking lists of mature composers as though they were tennis players or athletes, there is one inescapable fact as far as Mozart was concerned, and that is that he was the most precocious of musicians, composing a symphony at the age of 9 and an opera at the age of 11. This does not mean that he was idle at the age of 10. In fact, he was never idle for long, writing an astonishing number of masterpieces, be they operas, symphonies, chamber music, church music, right up to the time of his death, tragically at the early age of 35. Every form he studied was mastered at once. And whereas there is something pejorative about the word facile, in Mozart's hands, facility became as inevitable as a key which fits a lock and opens the door onto unexpected beauty. There is never any rational explanation of genius. Almost by definition, it defies description. And yet Mozart is an enigma even in a world of chess-playing children and wizard infants who crack the secret computer codes of governments and of intelligence services. After all, his miracles were constructive and as such have endured the passage of time. Symphonies and operas were committed to paper practically without correction. He was wonderfully right the first time round, and it was much more inspiring for him to write a new work rather than fretfully to attempt to correct the old one, which was exactly as he wanted it in any case. This unprepossessing little fellow had the unique capacity to be inspired as well as conscientious. Salzburg is a wonderfully proportioned little city, divided by the Salzach River and possessing something of Mozart's duality. In sunlight, it is tranquil and majestic, with its high cliffs rising from the city's center. In a storm or under autumnal clouds, the same physical features which give it a noble restraint, a smiling condescension, turn hostile, and they seem to betray a confirmation of God's omnipotence. The city has not changed much over the centuries, even if the draconian authority of the Archbishop has surrendered to the hordes of jet-setters, bejeweled duchesses, and simple music lovers, come to worship at the shrine of its greatest native son, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. In 1756, the date of Mozart's birth, the city already boasted some 14,000 burghers, and it was regarded as a mecca of the arts, science, even of mere polity. Leopold Mozart, Wolfgang Amadeus's father, was held to be among the most intelligent and erudite of all Salzburgers. In point of fact, he was not an authentic son of the city, having been born in Augsburg in Bavaria. But he studied logic in Salzburg and eventually became a distinguished musician in that city. There was nothing remarkable in such peregrinations in Central Europe. Hardly any musician was a native of the city where he found employment. Leopold was assistant Kapellmeister at the Archbishop's court and author of the most comprehensive primer available on the subject of the violin and its playing. At the time of Wolfgang Amadeus's birth in this house, Leopold was 37, already 2 years older than his son was ever destined to be. He was an extremely handsome man, and his wife was a famous beauty. Their eldest surviving child, Nana, was worthy of her parents as far as looks were concerned. But young Wolfgang was a sickly child and grew into a short young man with few positive physical attributes. It was as though the gods not only decreed that they loved him sufficiently to justify his early death, but that even during life it would have been unjust for him to possess gifts other than genius. To Leopold, it seemed at first as though his children were equally endowed. They both had a superb ear, sure memory, and an uninhibited desire to perform. He dedicated his life to their education and the broadening of their minds, including not only music, but other subjects, such as mathematics, languages. He even emulated Johann Sebastian Bach, that giant among educators, by composing for his children a book containing 26 suites in all keys, interspersed with works of influential musicians of the past, such as Handel and Telemann. Gradually, Wolfgang began to mark his ascendancy over his sister. There are always those who say that had Beethoven had Leopold as a father, he would have been as great an infant prodigy as Mozart. But here again is a mental exercise for critics. There's no guarantee that Beethoven would have been as obedient as young Mozart. Certainly his music doesn't for a moment sound like that of an obedient mind, even if Mozart's music sounds deceptively as though he had nothing to learn. Beethoven sounds as though he learned principally from himself. Whatever the truth of these idle speculations, there is no doubt that Mozart benefited hugely from the sensitivity and wisdom of his father's teaching. When Leopold judged that the moment had come, he arranged for his children's concert debut in Munich. They were triumphantly acclaimed, both by the public and by the Bavarian court. They were showered with gifts and praise. Leopold decided to sacrifice his own smaller, safer career in the interests of his children. The years of wandering began. Mozart spent almost 10 years of his short life in travel, nearly all of them as a child. Not only Munich, but Mannheim, Versailles, Amsterdam, London opened their hearts and their pockets to this gifted family of vagabonds. In Vienna, little Wolfgang was able to snatch a kiss from Maria Theresia and gauchely ask for her daughter's hand in marriage, tiny Marie Antoinette, the future Queen of France, to the enchantment of the court. In Paris, Madame de Pompadour set the little fellow on an ornamental chair and circled him slowly like a lioness at lunchtime, trying to assess the nature of his genius with mischievous eyes. In London, he was actually allowed to stand behind the king's chair during dinner, a very English understanding of the nature of privilege. The children performed on various instruments, improvised, and in fallow periods indulged in party tricks, such as performing on a keyboard covered in cloth. By now, the two children were the sole breadwinners of the family, but there was no sense of imbalance here or friction. Each member knew his or her job, as they do in every family of professionals devoted to a single discipline, be they acrobats or musicians. Nevertheless, despite their cohesion, Leopold began to concentrate more and more on his son at the expense of his daughter. After all, she was only a girl who happened to play the piano brilliantly, while the lad was becoming known as a composer. Lament the psychologists of today, a wretched lad, disgracefully exploited by a greedy father. No school life, no playmates of his own age, primped like a toy poodle for the aristocracy to throw balls to and giggle at his antics. The little man with his costume and his sword, as Goethe once wrote, a smile ill-concealed behind the word. Well, the trouble may perhaps be that history has recorded practically no cases of preschool or teenage psychologists. Indeed, it's doubtful if a marriage counselor who only had to shave every other day would command the requisite respect. The truth is that although Mozart was still a child in some ways, and remained a child all his life in others, he adapted himself rapidly to an adult world, and he found his way within it according to the dictates of a growing intelligence and experience. He enjoyed it. Also, he knew very clearly how to give pleasure to those older than himself, one of the tricks of the trade, and he had to look no further than to his beloved father for an example. Leopold by now fulfilled every function from impresario to accountant. They shared a room in order to economize. And when, after a grueling examination, Wolfgang was elected a member of the famous Bologna Philharmonic Society, the youngest member ever, it was a triumph of both son and father. The women of the family could only applaud from far away. For some time, they had been relegated to holding the fort in Salzburg. As the years went by, interest in Mozart as a Wunderkind waned, for the simple reason that the Wunder had developed just as the Kind was slowly disappearing. There was no point in further peregrinations. It was time to settle down and accept the different rules of adult life. The only solution available to Leopold was the generous offer of the Archbishop of Salzburg to reinstate him as assistant Kapellmeister and to find employment for the young genius on the side. Wolfgang had traveled and tasted celebrity, the most dangerous of all addictions. He had charmed crowned heads and been flattered by them. Could he now subject himself to the small-town rigors of Salzburg, to the family reunion, a return to a childhood he had never really savored? Well, tell us, O psychologists. Mozart provided the answer. When I play here, I have the feeling that it's not people, but the wooden chairs beneath them that are listening. Society here is so provincial. How can I be asked to live in a town without an opera house? Another voyage was inevitable to counter claustrophobia. Leopold was the first to realize it. The Archbishop read Leopold's mind, however, and threatened to give him the sack if he took another sabbatical. There was nothing for it but to reverse the rule. Leopold stayed in Salzburg with daughter Nano, while Frau Mozart chaperoned her son on the road. The farewells were long and earnest. Mozart and his mother were heaped with good advice and letters of introduction. The first two stops were Augsburg and Mannheim. In Mannheim, Mozart's ears and eyes were open to entirely new musical trends, marking the end of the Baroque period, the birth of the sonata form with its 4 movements, the death of the ground bass. Strong dynamics were not only permitted, but actually encouraged. And here Mozart heard the clarinet for the first time. And what a rich discovery that would prove to be. This movement was from the so-called Paris Symphony. Paris was to be Mozart's final destination, but although eager for new successes, Mozart was strangely unwilling to leave Mannheim. Now, could all this be due to the hypnotic influence of the clarinet? No, he fell in love. Aloysia Weber was her name, a soprano with a splendid voice and looks to match, and of an age fit to be loved by a prodigy. She was 15 years old. Her father was a man of modest means, but her mother was, despite this obvious handicap, a determined and ambitious matchmaker. Mozart was rapturously received. There were 3 other daughters yet to marry, and these things had to be done tidily, in order. Aloysia would be the first to go. After that, there would be time for the 14-year-old, the 13-year-old, and all that. Mozart was inflamed by the mother's enthusiasm. He could steer Aloysia to great notoriety, teach her, open the artistic pinnacles of Italy to her. And perhaps a function could be found for the father of modest means, some modest job as a mentor, as befitted the means. N'est-ce pas, papa? Wrote Wolfgang, seeking encouragement from Leopold. N'est-ce pas, papa? Reiterated Leopold. For once, the echo was far louder than the original phrase. Have you lost your mind? And what about your career? Have you forgotten the purpose of your trip? Leopold was desperate. He felt so far away from all that was going on. And it was not his role. It had never happened before. And yet now, thanks to that confounded archbishop, he overstated his case in endless correspondence. And he even went so far as to lose his judgment. Be practical, he ranted. Compose according to local taste. Transform the enthusiasm of others into concrete commissions. Earn money! Money. Money. And finally, regarding women, your present interest, I can only say, beware. And again, beware. A man who fails to exercise self-control in this finest of arts finds himself in the gutter with 6 hungry, screaming babies. It was a measure of his lack of judgment and overstatement that he repeated money 3 times, beware only twice. But he multiplied the baby, which might have resulted from an indiscretion, by 6. In desperation, since no satisfactory reaction was forthcoming to his wild exaggerations, he exercised the classical prerogative of the male parent, authority. To Paris at once! With your mother. Paris, which had been among the first great cultural centers to acquaint him with success, now was the first to acquaint him with failure. The main artistic conflict of the time was that between the followers of the German Gluck and those of the Italian Piccini. It excited passions which the Tour de France on bicycles or the World Cup soccer matches would produce today. And in this unruly atmosphere, nobody had time for a superannuated adolescent in conflict with absolutely no one. This was bad enough, but there was worse to come. Dispirited and homesick, Mozart's mother suddenly collapsed and died. And for the first time in his life, the young man was alone. Curiously, Mozart was not unduly depressed by his mother's death. His attitude towards death had always been equivocal, and he recognized that it was death which gave life its dimension, its values, in fact, its meaning. As such, it was deserving of feelings of friendship by those conscious of their own mortality. Now, the one to suffer was he who one would have thought to be more philosophical. Leopold could not bear the loss of his beloved wife, coupled with his now irrevocable solitude. It made him wish to dominate his son as never before. He threatened, cajoled, begged, and blackmailed. "My life and death are in your hands," he wrote. Reluctantly but obediently, Mozart returned home, but by easy stages. He sojourned in several towns and even returned to rekindle the embers of his passion for Aloysia. She had meanwhile become a celebrated singer accredited to the Bavarian court in Munich, improving her family's finances and heightening Frau Weber's ambitions for her daughters. Mozart's declarations were met with complete indifference. A serious blow. It was a broken-hearted young man who returned home to his father's house. But not for long. He was commissioned to write the opera Idomeneo, and soon he rushed away for the premiere. To Munich.
Bella coppia un donneggiero servato a voi. Quando a sperarvi lite creda fortunata.
It was a great success. The Weber family had by now moved to Vienna, so there were many to praise him, but nobody to whom he could say, "I told you so." But such was the extent of his triumph that nothing could now hold him back, and he determined to abandon Salzburg once and for all, shedding security, sisterly love, and his father's admonitions. Naturally, there was an alternative. Vienna. was sent there temporarily by his patron, but then refused to return. The row, according to Mozart, extended to screaming and even to kicking. Well, whoever provoked the high spirits, Mozart claimed to have been both abused and insulted. Reason enough to stay in Vienna. At last, a metropolis, a city fit for a genius to live in, with an opera house. But to practical things. Even a genius needs somewhere to house his luggage, to rest his head. How about lodging with the Webers? They would surely take him in, since the breadwinner of modest means had died, and they were now living under somewhat reduced circumstances. Aloysia, she'd married. Idomeneo had come too late. Oh, but there were 3 others, waiting like taxis on a rank. However, Mozart had absolutely no intention of getting married. Why should I, he wrote to his suspicious father. This is a time for me to devote to my career. Just what Leopold would have said himself. Mozart went on, besides, if I had married every woman with whom I have flirted, I would have had 200 wives by now. Leopold liked this somewhat less, and he was right to have his qualms. A few months and some letters later, Mozart found himself betrothed to Constanze Weber. At the outset of his time as a paying guest, he still prowled round the married Aloysia for old time's sake, to no avail. However, the other Weber women are so kind to me. They cook for me, mend my socks, and with Constanza tending to my every need, I can really work here. He confides in Leopold. The latter reacts by return of post. Move out! Move out! Before it's too late! Leopold is one to say everything at least twice, as we have already noticed. But then he is haunted by the specter of the 6 howling brats who make composition impossible. The gossip spreads as it can only in Vienna. They've been seen together, you know. Oh, yes. Is it love, you think? No. The opera was only a success in Munich, you know, and even there they say that No other man will have her now. Oh, my poor Constanza, said Frau Weber. Poor Mrs. Weber, poor Constanza. Mozart protests his innocence in a letter. I swear to you, Father, I have done nothing whatsoever. I've not even seen the girl. Unless her mother was present. In a subsequent letter, the tone has changed and adapted itself to Leopold's growing suspicions. It remains jocular in order to take the heat off the contents, but it also shows how well Mozart knew his father. Dear Father, I'm in love. For God's sake, not one of the Webers. For God's sake, yes, one of the Webers. She's the best of them all. Oh, well, nobody would call Constanza a beauty, although the eyes are nice, and clever? No, not really. But she's quite able to fulfill her duties as a wife and mother. Money? She has none. But we simple folk should marry for love. Besides, I'm 27 years old, and I've never known a woman. Nature calls! Ooh. Someone close to the Webers supplies a contract. Either Mozart will marry the girl within 3 years, or else provide for her for the rest of her life. Constanza sees the contract. She tears it up, saying, "Your word is enough for me, Herr Mozart." A shrewd move. She already knows her man. This is no woman, but an angel. He stammers, and he marries Constanza before Leopold has time to consent. He then writes, no, not another letter, the C minor Mass, as promised, if Constanza was willing. One promise deserves another. Mozart plunged into composition with a new intensity, growing in fame by the day, almost by the hour. When the Emperor Joseph II commissioned a new opera from him, Mozart decided on the abduction from the seraglio. The subject was exotic, Turkey was very popular at the time, and the heroine's name, Constanza. The first of Mozart's 5 great operas was underway.
Die wird die Steine Hut verkennen, weil das bleibt ewig dir geweiht. An jedem Ort, zu jeder Zeit, wird ich die groß und edel nennen. Wer so viel Mut vergessen kann, den sieht man mit Verachtung an. Wer so viel Mut vergessen kann, den sieht man mit Verachtung an. Über die Himmel und das Leben, vergessen man den Anstieg ein. Mein Herz erlebt und gemein, ich muss nicht angehen, so viel Huld vergessen kann, und wie man nicht verachten kann. Wer so viel Huld vergessen kann, und wie man nicht verachten kann. Wenn ich es je vergessen könnte, da ich dann erdrosselt war, und all der anderen Gefahr ich lieb, als ob der Kopf mir brennte. Wer so viel Huld vergessen kann, den sie man nicht verachten kann. Wer so viel Huld vergessen kann, den sie man nicht verachten kann. Was kann ich noch nicht befreien, jeder Kopf und Lagerst so. Doch bin ich recht von Herzen froh, dass ich nicht an jeder Scheidung, denn sehe nur das Kind und mein Der Prinzenzsäule waren die Hunde, die uns so schrecklich hinterging. Es ist nicht länger anzusehen, es hat die Zunge fast im Munde, ihren Lohn zu ordnen an. Ist geköpft, der gehangen, der gebiest, auf ein Schlangen, der verbrannt, der gebunden und getauft, zuletzt gefunden. Ist geköpft, der gehangen, der gebiest, auf ein Schlangen, der verbrannt, der gebunden und getauft, ist gefunden. Ich bin so hässlich als die Rache, ich bin so hässlich als die Rache, ich bin so hässlich als die Rache. Hingegen endlich ewig sein und ohne einen Mut verzeihen, ist nur der Großland, der Große.
If there is a single overture which most stimulates impatience of the curtain to rise, it would have to be that of the Marriage of Figaro. The urgency of the strings, the prattle of the woodwind, the rhythmic drive that fills the listener with an excitement which the darkness of the opera house can no longer contain, and which will, not a moment too soon or late, force the curtain to rise in a blaze of light. There have been many great composers of opera, both tragic and comic, but perhaps none have expressed universality better than Mozart, by means of an uncanny power of observation and a deep instinctive insight into the tragic-comic nature of the human being. Did not his relationship with others prove his gifts? His letters to his father, partly engaged in efforts to convince, partly detached and humorously gauging the results of his strategies. It was impossible to be angry with him for long, as Leopold found out to his cost. For Wolfgang had that rarest of gifts. He could lie in order better to tell the truth. And therein is the whole art of the theater. And then to be able to translate his thoughts into music as well. The period between the Marriage of Figaro and the marriage of Mozart was doubtless the happiest of his life. He adored his little wife, Constanza, and refused to allow Leopold and Nannerl's icy disapproval of her to cast a shadow over their happiness. Oh, a few minor financial problems cropped up here and there, but they were nothing that simple people in love couldn't cope with. Even Leopold began to admit grudgingly that his son was on the road to riches and stability. Riches and stability. Mozart composed incessantly, published many works for subscribers, and appeared in concerts, usually with outstanding success. The Vienna of the Emperor Joseph II was now his city. The emperor himself was relatively progressive, supported the arts, liked music, So long as it didn't strain either the emotions or the intellect. Producing The Marriage of Figaro in Vienna was by no means easy. Already the play, the second of a trilogy by the French wit Beaumarchais, had been forbidden on the stage in Vienna. Too egalitarian, too political altogether, explained the emperor, describing what many, with the advantage of hindsight, have since called an advance notice of the French Revolution. Lorenzo da Ponte, Mozart's new librettist, set out to change the emperor's mind. Now, if anyone could do it, he could. He had practically every weapon to convince. Among his credentials were the fact that he was at once a converted Jew and a retired priest, a libertine, an acquaintance of Casanova's. Under what conditions they met is not on record. He managed to convince the emperor that his version of Figaro would be non-political and anti-egalitarian. And such were the gifts of conviction asked in his previous careers that he managed to turn the refusal into a commission and share with Mozart an outstanding success.
Non più avrai questi bei pennacchini, quel cappello leggero e galante, quella chioma, quell'aria brillante, quel vermiglio non è scoccolò, non più avrai quei pennacchini, quel cappello, quella chioma, quella non ti andrai farfallone amoroso, notte e giorno ritorno di rambo, e le belle trovando le foto, l'accidenza docino l'amore, e le belle trovando le foto, l'accidenza docino l'amore. Vieni sotto il pacco, grande sacco, trecca sacco, lo pisalla, sable bianco, collo dritto, muso franco, un gran casco, un gran turbante, molto onor, poco contante, poco contante, poco contante.
Needless to say, natural talent and a sense of mischief pull far greater weight than the ephemeral, if pious, promises to emperors. And The Marriage of Figaro turned out to be a work of sharp social criticism, implying all that the emperor had seen in it in the first place, and feared.
Non più andrai farfallone amoroso, notte e giorno ritorno di rambo, e le belle trovando le foto, l'accidenza docino d'amore, e le belle trovando le foto, l'accidenza docino d'amore.
The speed with which Mozart could turn out masterpieces was more than merely astounding. Of course, masterpieces took him no longer than did minor work. His last three great symphonies were all written within the span of a single month. All of Figaro was composed in 6 weeks, no longer than it takes to mount a well-known opera today. His publisher used to leave manuscript paper strewn over the anteroom of his office, this in case Mozart dropped in to ask for an advance. At least let him compose something before I accede to his request, growled the publisher. Inevitably, there were those envious of Mozart's success. There were even some envious of his talent. He didn't help matters by being totally immodest. "I'm the best," he said, with quiet assurance, and then added as an afterthought, "Only Haydn is my equal." Haydn, older and wiser, could find access to the currency of generosity, not merely to the small change. "Your son," he writes to Leopold, "is the greatest composer known to me." Soon after this exchange of compliments, Haydn left for London, and Mozart was left without a kindred spirit, or an equal. Mozart was so exceptionally endowed with inexhaustible invention and a sense of musical structure and grace that it was perhaps unfortunate that he couldn't have spared a fraction of that grace in dealing with some of his less gifted contemporaries. His arrogance was really unnecessary. A work like the unique symphony in C major, the Jupiter, was far more eloquent than words, and its wounds, inflicted on lesser lights, were far more lacerating. One of the more uncanny traits of Mozart's character was its complete divorce from the realities of every day. When things were deeply depressing, he was capable of writing the most joyous and uninhibited music. When things were going well, he could write tragically. At the same time, he possessed a sense of character and even a profound wisdom in dramatizing fictional men and women in an opera, which he was utterly incapable of adapting for his own daily use in life. He was as wayward a person as his work was disciplined. One minute he could be a victim, a kind of latter-day bewigged hippie, prey to his own generosity. The next he could be petulant and silly, unworthy of his better nature. Was he an adult man or merely an overgrown child? It depended on the moment and on the circumstances. When not working and single-minded, he was usually gentle, good-natured, full of life. He liked fencing and riding horses. At one point, he was the proud owner of 6 ponies. 6. Leopold had never warned him of that. He was an excellent dancer and gymnast, often turning somersaults to emphasize some point. He was also a natural prankster, leaping onto furniture and frightening the ladies with a sudden, fearfully realistic meow. When a bird died unexpectedly, he conducted the funeral service and rehearsed the choir. Billiards could be accounted a vice of his. He played it with passion and gambled assiduously on the results, losing more than one shirt in the process, and sometimes writing music while awaiting his turn. Above all else, he enjoyed word games and far-fetched puns, especially when they involved words not in current use, at least not in drawing rooms. He had no aversion to dirty ones, with a marked preference for scatology, that is written S-C-A, if you have to look it up. But under normal conditions, Mozart gave every appearance of refinement, speaking fluently in French and Italian, well-versed in culture, an avid theater-goer, and above all, a hard worker, in bed by midnight, up and about by 5 a.m., to lead the life of a freelance musician of the time. Pragmatism was not considered alien to the sublime. No one had eternity in mind while composing. If a musician was not lucky enough to occupy a high position in court, however, he was expected not only to perform on a variety of instruments, to compose occasional music, to conduct and train musicians, to organize local musical life, and to be a consummate politician, as the pernicious intrigues of court life threatened to wash away his achievements at all times. Mozart gave concerts at which his own new works were played, either symphonic or chamber music, or for solo instruments. And there might be some time set aside for improvisation on given themes, all in the course of one long evening. These soirees were rather pretentiously called academies, and part of Mozart's duties was to print and to sell the tickets. After all, wasn't he a musician? At this time, pragmatism reigned supreme. A composer wrote for the instruments available at any given time and no nonsense. Or he might be able to sell works by subscription for amateurs to play at home. No centre of the arts has played a bigger role in the history of music than Vienna. This imperial city on the Danube attracted the greatest creative talents, as well as the most ambitious of mediocrities, which spelled trouble among a snobbish aristocracy, unable to distinguish the two groups from each other with any degree of confidence. Vienna became the inevitable arena for the game of musical backbiting, a city in which coffee and scandal were both served up in small cups with an abundance of whipped cream, usually in the same place at the same time. Mozart had been a butt of these intrigues, a tradition which lasts to this day, when, as a child, he had seen the premiere of his opera La Finta Semplice cancelled as a result of backstage infighting by older colleagues. Later, he reported to his father his delight at the failure of Salieri to sabotage the performance of Figaro. It is to Salieri's credit that he was one of those jealous of Mozart's talent, not merely jealous of his career. But of course, he had no need to be. He had been, from an extremely tender age, the uncrowned monarch of Vienna's musical life, a confidant of the imperial family, teacher of the great and the wealthy, to say nothing of his being an excellent administrator. The malicious rumors suggesting that Salieri had murdered Mozart are, of course, fairy tales, immortalized by Pushkin in his verse drama Mozart and Salieri, and later perpetuated by Peter Shaffer's play Amadeus. As a pretext for a fictionalized drama, it's perfect dramatic material, but it is distinctly disturbing that such actions are attributed to men who once lived and reacted rather differently to one another. Salieri not only admired Mozart, but at the premiere of The Magic Flute was seen and heard to lead the applause after every number. Beethoven thought highly of him and was astounded that he should volunteer to play the timpani at the premiere of Beethoven's own Wellington Victory Symphony. If any good has come out of the whole wretched distortions, quite apart from the enjoyment of Pushkin and Peter Shaffer's art, it is that the music of Salieri is enjoying a distinct revival in concert, on record, and on tape. It's perhaps a paradox, but as too often, the paradox is only just. Mozart died of natural causes, as did many others during a cholera epidemic. But it's true that Mozart's late championship of opera in German did seem a particular provocation to the influential Italian lobby in the musical life of Vienna, especially after his triumphs with the opera in Italian. The battle for the emperor's attention was unending, and the contention between the two languages was particularly fierce in Austria, where German was officially spoken, but which had a predilection for the sheer musicality of Italian and a predilection for music itself. The premiere of Don Giovanni took place in Prague, a city not less musical than Vienna, but with far less inhibited complexes. It was a triumph. The subsequent reception in Vienna was lukewarm. The emperor, forever nervously in search of the common touch, explained it this way: divine music, but a bit too tough for our Viennese teeth to chew on. There were some who found Da Ponte's libretto to be as improvised as seduction itself. Later, Beethoven was to declare the theme to be morally unsuitable for opera, as opposed to life, one supposes. But by then, Beethoven was too late. The public had taken the opera to its heart, as Mozart knew it would eventually.
Padron siamo tutti
The figure of the Commendatore, more impressive as a stone effigy than as a swordsman in his dotage, has been subject to many interpretations, as has Don Giovanni, the compulsive seducer, coveter of other men's possessions, inveterate trampler of the greener grass. Mozart, with his penetrating perception, shows that despite his emotional impotence, Don Giovanni could not have succeeded in his seductions without the tantalizing encouragement of his quarries. Seduction, he says, is complicity. It's not rape. It is the thrilling act of compelling a contribution from the victim towards her own eventual downfall. For the sake of tight-lipped hypocrisy, Mozart arranged a terrible retribution for Don Giovanni, while he himself enjoyed the attentions of 3 prima donnas singing the parts of Donna Anna, Elvira, and Zerlina during rehearsals. As he might have said in his perfect French, jamais deux sans trois, never two without three.
Più non sperate di ritrovarlo, più non cercate, lontano a voi, lontano a voi. Non volete, che non posso, che non posso, se non posso, se non posso, se non posso. Da due fuoco, da un poco, l'uomo di sacco, fermate il passo, giusto da sotto, tiene il gran posto, tutto dal diavolo, per strangolare, per elemento.
No, Mozart might not have been a husband free from blemish, but he was exceptionally devoted to the idea of marriage, and therefore to Constanze. His love for and obedience of his father had been exemplary most of the time. And after Leopold's death, Constanze was the only person really close to him most of the time. Unfortunately, she was a woman who tended to wear her limitations on her sleeve. Her understanding of the inner world of her husband was close to non-existent. She couldn't even understand what in her husband was different to other men. To her, he was a devoted husband who tried to attend to all her needs, and there her comprehension ended. She was no nest builder or creator of harmony. She wasn't even shrewd in business or an intellectual heavyweight. Her only attraction seems to have been entirely physical. Their 6 children died in infancy, not unusual at that time, but a hardship for all women of all times. Whenever Constanze was not pregnant or recovering from a pregnancy, she was ill, indulging in long and expensive cures at watering places, adding to the continual anxiety about money which plagued Mozart's life. He suffered a great deal during these separations and couldn't refrain from allowing her frivolity to play on his imagination. I beg of you, refrain from visiting the casinos, he implored, sounding more and more like Father Leopold. Your conduct is unsuitable for that of a married woman. Think of my honor. What? All right, think of our honor then. On one occasion he climbed unannounced through a window. Did he suspect that she was not alone? Perhaps he remembered the fate of the absent lovers in his own opera, Così fan tutte.
E scappa da fanno, ma tali finiscano qua, ma tali finiscano qua. Non è la sapete che dire per favor, ma se non è che avevo del qua, ma il prove lasciamo, o fuori a mano, o fuori a mano, o fuori a mano, oh pazzo desire, io ribocca, oh pazzo desire, io ribocca, io cercar di non soffrire, quel male che trova che sì, e voltone va, io cercar di non soffrire, quel male che trova che sì, e voltone va, che sì,
Così fan tutte, or the School for Lovers, was a robust commentary on the morality of both sexes, what there is of it, which probably is why the plot was accused of thinness. The opera marked Mozart's last collaboration with the notorious Da Ponte, who was shortly to leave for New York as an immigrant, where he surprisingly fell in love and settled down to be an exemplary, monogamous husband. Ah, the effect of American morality at that time. Many years later, he arranged the American premiere of Don Giovanni in New York. He boasted to sections of the audience in the intermission that he was the opera's librettist. A librettist? And what would that be, sir? The music has always seemed to unconditional admirers of Mozart to be far superior to the libretto, a fate equally suffered by the magic flute. But the fact remains that the text inspired Mozart and therefore cannot be as indifferent as their detractors maintain. And recent productions of Così fan tutte have placed ambiguous areas of the text into clear and unexpected focus, demonstrating that what seemed to be wayward was in fact a very sophisticated, a very modern subtlety, not at all at variance with the music. could be that Mozart identified more easily with the emotions of single voices or instruments than with voices or instruments treated as a mass, which is why perhaps his predominant art forms were the opera and the concerto rather than the symphony or the string quartet. Well, naturally, he wrote masterpieces in all known forms, but those with solo parts appear to find him in a more natural element. The piano and the violin, of course, dominate, but he wrote splendid works for flute, clarinet, bassoon, horn, and for combinations of instruments, including two great masterpieces, one for flute and harp, one for violin and viola. While Mozart played several instruments, he was at heart a man of the keyboard. And practically the totality of his 23 piano concerti are works of utter perfection. His new format was that of an even-handed dialogue between the piano and the orchestra, unmatched in both complexity and simplicity by any other composer with the exception of Beethoven. Most moving of all, perhaps, are the melodic lines of the slow movements, which miraculously transcend the technical possibilities of the time, making the keyboard sing. And here we are again, sing, like the human voice. Mozart was in no way a revolutionary. He didn't need to destroy existing forms in order to recreate. On the contrary, he accepted the rules as he was taught them. A sonata possessed a preordained form. A piano concerto had to have 3 movements. A string quartet 4. There's nothing revolutionary in just changing the form, the mold. It's the content which is open to influence, and always must be, like a river, like life itself. It was by his treatment of the texture that Mozart became such a preeminent innovator, using the existing musical vocabulary and without jostling established principles of composition. Mozart nevertheless touched on modulations never heard before, chromatic lines reaching into the distant future by way of Beethoven and Schubert. It seems preposterous that a man of his artistic stature could have been unable to obtain some kind of official appointment despite his enormous celebrity. But years earlier, Maria Theresia had warned her son, the Crown Prince, against offering employment to that useless gypsy. And with this tender assessment, all hopes of a court appointment were irrevocably dashed. The final year of Mozart's life was marked by a continual anxiety. Vienna, the city of fickle loyalties, seemed no longer to recognize him. Concert attendances plummeted, subscribers were hard to find, debts kept accruing, the losses at the billiard table grew dangerously. There was a shortage of money which had become chronic. And during this period of stress, Mozart's greatest source of strength came from his affiliation with Freemasonry. At that time, there was no whiff of heresy attached to Masonic lodges. The church accepted their enlightened views as legitimate and didn't consider them a threat to its authority until years later. Mozart certainly shared the feelings of universal brotherhood inherent in the movement, and also had cause to be grateful for its profound sense of human interdependence. Time and again, a member of his lodge, Michael Puchberg, came to his rescue with financial assistance. And reading Mozart's letters to Puchberg is a truly depressing experience. However sad his predicament, one can't help wondering if Mozart's undoubted poverty was really quite as desperate as his self-pity dictated. There were nearly always enough funds for a new suit, and there was a servant of his at his disposal until the very end. Things actually improved a little. He was offered and accepted a modest position at court, after all, not in the least commensurate with his dignity, of course. And then immediately afterwards an opera to celebrate the coronation of Leopold II, La Clemenza di Tito. Immediately after that, another opera was commissioned, this time by the popular theater of Schikaneder in Vienna, an opera pantomime with a Masonic color, the magic flute. And finally, in this series of windfalls, came a commission for, of all things, a requiem, a funeral mass. No work of fiction, not even by Pushkin, could have imagined circumstances more hair-raising than those governing Mozart's last commission. One evening, a man dressed entirely in grey appeared at Mozart's door with a strange request. Mozart was to write a requiem mass for a very large fee. There was only one string attached. Both composer and donor were to remain forever anonymous. Later, the mystery was clarified. A certain Count Walsegg intended to present the work as his own. At the time, Mozart asked no questions. He needed the money. He was 35, but casual observers would have thought him older, considerably. Youth and enthusiasm had been banished from his features. His complexion was yellow, his skin pockmarked. A fatal disease was busy on its work of destruction. He raced against time. The man in grey appeared to be Providence itself. Despite his heroic efforts, the work was never finished. On his deathbed, Mozart rehearsed the Lacrimosa for one last time with his family and a few friends. And then he died. He never feared death, and certainly would not have viewed his own death as anything more solemn than the natural consequence of having lived. Many died young: Schubert, Mendelssohn, Chopin, Bellini. Berlioz, who didn't live too long himself, said irritatedly about Chopin, he spent the whole of his life dying. But Mozart left a body of work behind which would have gratified a centenarian. His burial in a mass grave would have seemed quite normal to him also. It was a common practice at that time, or perhaps the practice with commoners, whose money had to be kept for the living, and for whom there was nothing left over for the pomp. In any case, what could you expect from a society whose empress referred to one of the greatest talents of all time as a useless gypsy? And wasn't it that lady's daughter who eventually said, "Let them eat cake"? Once he was gone, he excited every imagination. Even if it's not necessarily the way of the world, it was the way of Vienna. The King of Prussia bought up Mozart's manuscripts for a large sum of money. The Emperor of Austria accorded Constanze a pension. And as for that lady herself, she recovered her health overnight and became the iron-willed businesswoman who skillfully cashed in on the sudden resurgence of her poor dead husband's popularity. Mozart's sister, Nannerl, and Constanze, the widow, lived not far from each other in Salzburg, and by virtue of their physical proximity, were able to carefully nurture their mutual animosity. Though Mozart's surviving sons didn't amount to much, the final irony to the imagined libretto of Mozart's life was that the wealthy Freemason who so generously contributed to Mozart's well-being ended his life poorer and more miserable than Mozart had ever been. In death, as before, Mozart's personal life and creative life existed on different planes. In creation, he could play all the parts, good and evil, investing his villains with surprising compassion and heroes with all too human weaknesses. He gave life to what were merely marionettes to start with, and for the space of 3 hours could play the part of God in his own intimate universe, to the enlightenment and enchantment of his public. In life, he could control no one and nothing. The whims of emperors, the caprices of women, the jealousies of men, the eroticism of divas in the wings, the diabolical betrayal of billiard balls. And once he had sunk to that level, why try to control himself? No, the only reality worth considering was the artifice, the better world dreamed of by the Masons, unattainable, beautiful, infinitely kind, awash in a sea of magical sounds, which even the sturdy voices of 6 hungry babies could not penetrate for long.